Hello, everyone, and welcome to our projects that we've been working on. Now, in the previous video, we created a register form where we're able to register users to our application. Now, I want to create a login. So to create that login, first of all, we need two edit texts, which is a username, a password, and the button that when we click on, that button would check if the username and password exist in the database. If not, obviously you want to tell the user that they need to enter the right credentials or they have to register. In our application already, we already have our register form, but what we're going to be creating is a login form. So if I supposed to go back to the main screen of what we have before, this is what we have when our application first load. So what we need to add now is we need to add two edit texts, like I said, and then a login button. We already have a button register, which uses an intent to make us access our register activity. So I'm going to start off by going to my activity main. In my activity main, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the design section. I can write this in code, but I'm going to do design so that, like I said, I always combine both of them so that in case anybody is here and is new, they will be able to do that as well. So I'm going to grab a text, plain text. I'm going to drag that inside my linear layouts, that's what I have. And then I'm going to drag two texts. And then I'm also going to drag another button. And then what I'm going to do is the first edit text, I'm going to call it EDT, EDT username or EDT email address, because we want the person to log in with their email address. EDT email address log. The reason I'm adding the log to it because we already have an EDT email address already in the ID, already exists already. So I want to have a different one and refactor it. And I want to create another one, which I will say EDT password log. Log just stands for login. So that's the IDs that I have at the moment. And then Android Studio is telling me that the height is 45 dp. Okay, Android Studio, you can fix it for me. Thank you very much, Android Studio. You've done a good job. And then my button, I am going to call my button EDT BTN log in button, login log, which is fine. You can name anything you want to name it. I'm just calling it login log because I already have a button called login, button login. So I've just added log to it, all of them, just so that we know that's for the login. Now, when I've done this, I'm going to go to the code section because I've realized that my edit texts have a text. I don't want a text, I want a hint. The reason why I don't want a text is because whenever you use text, when the user starts to type, it will always have that name already existing. This name here already being there. But if we make it a hint, it will disappear as soon as the user starts to type in. So it's like a placeholder. It becomes a placeholder rather. So my button text will say login, and then, yeah, this is what we have so far. So if we go to the design section, we'll be able to see that this is what our application looks like. Let me go here and change it. It should be password. Okay, so this is our layout that we're going to be using for our login. Now let us go back to our main activity.java. I already have a button. I've already imported a button navigate register. I'm just going to create another variable, one of our objects from that. I'm going to call it button login log, which is what I'm going to attach as to my button login log in my layout. And then I'm going to now use edit text. I'm going to create variables from the edit text class or widget, they call it. And I'm saying edit email address log and EDTE password log. And then when I come down here, I am going to find view by ID. Like I told you, find view by ID is similar to document.getElement by ID, which is used in JavaScript and HTML and CSS. So in this case, BTN login log equals find the view by ID. R stands for resource, ID is what we're looking for. And then we have BTN login log. Now you can tell why I named it login log, because I already have something called button login. So login log. And then I need to do the same thing for my edit texts. So edt email address log equals find view by ID r.id. And then we would find edt email address log. And then same thing for edt password log equals find view by ID r.id edt password log. So we've now attached the handler to our components. Now the next thing we're going to do is when I click on my button login log, I want to check and get, first of all, is the fields empty? If it's empty, so the user that you need to insert something in order for us to check the database if it exists. Else, we just want to go to the database and check if that exists. So btn, again, similar to the same thing that this code that we have here. We just want to do button, and then want to call it button login log dot set on click listener, which is attaching an action, new view on click listener. And then all we're doing here is first of all, we are going to get whatever the user has entered inside the email address, edit text, and the password. So I want to create a string. So string variable str edt email address log. Let's just keep it for convention. And then edt email address log dot, and then you get methods. There is a method called get text, which would actually return us whatever the user has entered. And then we're going to just convert that to a string, because we want to compare strings. So string str edt, here I should have done edt dot password log equals edt password log dot get text dot to string. Now here, what we've done here so far is we are getting whatever the user enters inside the email address and the password log. And what we want to do now is we want to check to make sure that it's not empty. So if str email address log dot is empty is a method that comes along with a string. When you create strings, it's a method that exists with a string class or string variable. Because you know strings are not like integers. It's not a primitive data type. It's like an object, a data type. So if we do str edit email address log dot is empty and str edt password also is empty, so we're checking both of them at the same time, we want to output something to the user. Now what I usually do is I usually have a text view, or I can use a toast just as like an alert box. But I want to go back to my activity main, and I want to add a text view, which I can do in the code so that you see how it's done. So text view, if I start to do text view, I'm going to match the parent and I'm going to wrap the content. I want the width to match the parent, but the height should be what's actually inside. So now that I have my text view now, what I want to do is I want to give it an ID. And then I want to call it txt display info log. See how when I started to write it, it was giving me an ID that already exists, because there's already an ID that already exists called txt display info. So I'm going to call this txt info log. Then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back to my main activity .java. And then what I'm going to do is if the if the email address and password boxes are empty, I want to display something to the user. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, first of all, I need to find, I need to create a variable for my text view. So display info, and then display info find view by ID r.id dot display info log. And then here, what I'm going to do is I am going to set the text to whatever information I want to display in the text view. So we're going to say all fields required. Beautiful. So if the username and password fields are not empty, we want to go to the database to check if there exists a username or an email address and a password in there. Then we'll allow the user to go on to the next page. Now, to do that, what we're going to do here in this case is we're going to do this. TXT, what we're going to do is, first of all, we have to go to our DB Connect to create a method which would allow us to be able to check the database. So quite simple to do it. If you've been following these tutorials from the start, you know that we have a method already which allows us to check if something exists. So what we're going to do here is create a method which we're going to check the database to see if a username and password exists. So public boolean, for now I'm going to call it public void, and I'm going to say public void check check user login or check username password. Let's call that. And check username password is going to have an object of the users, so user. And then first we're going to do is we are going to create an SQLite database. So we're going to connect to the database now. DB equals this dot get writable database, because we're going to actually let's do read, because we're reading from the database. And then what we can do here is we're going to create a query. So our query is going to be string query equals, we can do several ways of doing this. There are several ways that we can get this done. First thing we can do is we can do a select query. So we can do select all from our DB table users, and then we can do where, then we can do where the ID equals, and then we can pass in this placeholder, and then we can also do just pass in here, and then we can also pass in. So select all from the DB table users where the ID, but we're not using ID, we're using user, where the column that we're using, we're checking for is the email address, if you remember. So email address equals to that, and password is equals to that as well. And then this is our query for now. So this is a simple query. So what we're going to do here, like I said, there's several ways you can do this. You can pass in directly email address equals users.get password or username, and pass it like if you've done SQL before, but if you haven't, I'm just going to do it this way just to show you. So we're doing select all from DB table users where the email address equals this question mark. It means it's a placeholder. This password is also a placeholder. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do db.raw query. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in my query. And then the second bit is my arguments. So because I have question marks here, which are placeholders, I'm going to pass in arguments. I'm going to do new string. And then inside of here, I am going to pass in the argument. So in this case, I'm going to do users.get email address, comma, users.get password. So what this is going to do is going to run this query. It's going to say select all from the table users where the email address equals the email address here and the password equals the password here. And then once we run our query, we should be able to get. So now we've run our query. We want to check to make sure that our query actually return anything. That's when we introduce something called a cursor. Now cursors, whenever we get data from the database, cursors helps us to store that information from the database in that cursor. So it stores it, it stores the columns, stores the rows as how it was done in the database. So cursors are quite useful for us. So I'm just going to store this whole return query. Let me call it cursor I'm going to store the whole query in this cursor. And now we want to check if our cursor returns something. So I want to check if the cursor dot moved to first. There's several ways of doing this. If the cursor dot move to first, what we want to do is we want to return true. That means that there's something in the cursor. Else, what we want to do is we want to return false. And it's giving us an error right now because we want to make it a Boolean. Okay. So fingers crossed this works. Like I said, there's several ways we can do this. Let's see if cursor don't move to first would work. So I've changed this into a Boolean. And then I have my check username and I've passed in my users object and I'm just checking to make sure the username and the password has been entered is correct. So if I go back to my main activity.java, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create an object for my users. So users, and then let's call it U1 equals new users. And then what we need to do now is our constructor requires us to create our users with a username, a password, first name, last name, etc. So we need to go back to our users class. This is a user class that we have already, which the user class has some information for us. So in our users class, all we've created is we've created some attributes in our user class, which has an ID, full name, email address, organization, phone number, password, and rank. Now, these are the columns that are available in our table. So in our table, in our database table, these are the columns that we have. And then I've created two constructors. First one takes in everything here. Second one just takes in the full name and email address. I'm going to create a second one, which we just use that constructor to just build an object which only takes in the email address and the password, because that's what we're going to use for login. So if I right click in any space, I'm going to go to generate and I'm going to go to getter and setter. Okay, so let's try that again. No fields without getters and setters. Oh, sorry, I'm clicking the wrong thing because the getters and setters have already been created. So there's no available field that can do it. So if we go to generate and we go to a constructor, I'm going to create my constructor. My constructor is only going to have an email address and a password, which would give us the opportunity to be able to create a users with just a username and password. So when I've created my users U1, I'm just going to pass in my str email address and my str password log. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do this, a Boolean result, because remember our DB Connect, our Boolean check username returns a true or a false. So I need to store that data type as also a Boolean because it's returning a true or false. So if I'm going to store the return type, I need to also create a Boolean variable because Boolean variable can only store Boolean variables. So Boolean result equals DB Connect, or what did we call it when we connected to the database? Okay, so I haven't created a database just yet. I haven't created an instance of my database. So to do that, what I need to do is do DB Connect, DB equals new DB Connect, and this. So what we're doing is I'm creating an instance from my DB Connect here, an object of it, and I'm just passing the context that it should work in this context. So in my Boolean result now, I just have to do DB dot check username password, and I'm just going to pass in U1. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do an if statement. Now in my if statement, I'm going to say if the result, I just leave it this way because this way just means if the result is true, then do whatever's in here, else do whatever's in here. So what I'm going to do is if the username actually exists, I want to do txt.display info. Actually, rather than displaying the info and say welcome, at that point, what we want to do is we want to allow the user the opportunity to just directly go to, let's say, our another page. But for this purpose, I'm just going to do this txt display.set text, and we're going to say, oh, welcome. But ideally, what I want to do is if the user is logged in, I want to navigate them directly to the manage events page, which is what we were creating earlier. But for the purpose of this tutorial, all I'm doing is txt display info.setText. And then else, I want to tell the user, get out of here, man. So this is our login page created. Now let us run it. Let's run it and see how it works.